Hello, and welcome to episode 28 of That 60s Recording Podcast, the podcast that has conversations inspired by the golden era of recording. So this week, we're talking with John Kurlander, who is a mix engineer, probably best known for mixing the Lord of the Rings trilogy soundtrack, for which he won 3 Grammys. So we're talking to a Grammy Award winner. However, he also played a hand in recording Abbey Road album by the Beatles, obviously, and McCartney 1, Badfinger, Red Rose Speedway, Elton John, Cliff Richard, Toto, Pete Townsend, and he's worked with lots of producers such as Mickie Most, worked on loads of West End cast recordings, as well as some sort of mainstream pop records in the later years, mainstream pop records. And also lots of well-known classical recordings, which obviously isn't my area of expertise, but yeah, it's a big names in that world. Also, I'm looking here, some video game soundtracks as well, which is pretty major. He's had a stupidly eclectic career. So this conversation sort of documents his path through starting at Abbey Road at 16, and then he was working at Abbey Road for 30 years. And did a huge amount of his work there, obviously, before going freelance. Okay, I've sounded very northern then, freelance. Goodness gracious, right. Goodness gracious, there you go. And I've balanced it out with an incredibly southern thing right there. Anyway, I've also got to tell you that I finally sorted myself out, and we have some mugs that you can buy to support the podcast. Whee! So if you're in the UK, you can buy one of these mugs for £15, including postage, through Royal Mail. And then if you're overseas, the postage will probably be slightly more, but depending on how I work it out, it might be included. I have to just double check the international postage things. But if you'd like to support the podcast and sort of keep helping me do this, then please go and buy one of those mugs. They're beautiful enamel mugs. They're very cool. And you can get them from my website, allyouneedisdrums.com, by the time that this comes out, and it will be under shop. So go and have a look there, please. And I thank you very much. I look forward to receiving pictures of you with them and posting them on my Instagram feed and all that kind of thing. Anyway, let's dive into the episode. Here we go. John Kurlander. So I am really pleased to be joined by John Kurlander, all the way from LA, and it's just gone 9 a.m. in LA. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for getting up early to speak to us. And thank you so much for giving us your time. It's really appreciated.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
So, I mean, if I'm honest, I'm looking at some notes I've got here that I've written, and I've got more notes for you than any other person I've interviewed. Your career has been, genuinely unbelievable. I mean, you say that almost as an exaggeration about some people's careers, but yours has literally been just astounding. You've done so much. You've got such a huge breadth of work. It's ridiculous. I mean, you've. In terms of just pop stuff, kind of pop in inverted commas, rock and roll,
Sorry, just to interrupt you.
Go for it. Yeah.
On that subject of it being ridiculous, one of quite early on when I moved to LA and getting into the film business here, one very prominent composer actually turned me down because he said, "I don't believe your bio. I think it's lies." And that was the end of the conversation.
Wow. Well, I mean,
no, it really was. It wasn't just. It wasn't just. I mean, he really meant it. He said, "No, I don't believe it."
That's crazy. I mean, I just spoke with Shel Talmy, and I know that he did a few. He told a few lies to get to where he was.
Well, I mean,
But yeah, I'm not accusing you of telling any lies. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's just it's. So I mean, I think of your career in sort of 3 facets. You've got the sort of pop and rock side of it, then the the sort of classical recording that you do, and then sort of film and filming, gaming, that kind of stuff. And I think it's fair to say in each of those three categories, you've got some, a CV that would be envied by anybody who just focuses on any one of those three.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm not expecting a response. I'm aware that I'm just sending flattery at you.
That's okay. That's fine.
I mean, I'm just trying to get the significance of what you've done. It is, before we start delving into how you got there.
All over. I mean, I think I've always thought it's good to, have eggs in more than one basket, and things in different areas. And also, I have quite a high or low boredom threshold, so it's good to move around. And one of the things is that pretty early on at EMI, which is now Abbey Road, there was a great division between pop and classical. And the guys who worked on classical were classical, and the guys who worked on pop were. And it even went down to some of the equipment in the consoles that, on the early EMI Red consoles, there were plug-in modules, EQ modules. And one said pop and one said classical, and everything was divided. And the paperwork for the sessions, the things we used to fill in called recording sheets. Also, the first thing at the top left, you had to fill in pop or classical. So that's how different it was. And a lot of people, after their initial training at Abbey Road, went one direction or the other. And I guess what you said about me is I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do a bit of everything.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. Obviously we'll talk a little bit about that as we go down. Something I want to ask you first is, on your website, you describe yourself as a balance engineer. Now, you might think this an odd question, but I mean, especially in now, young people growing up will think balance engineer is an odd phrase. I just wondered if you could describe, because I mean, a mix engineer, you imagine doing all these things that people tell you need to do on YouTube, and actually, yeah.
I think that's just me being obtuse, really.
Oh,
really, it really does go back to the 60s, and not just EMI, but it's a 60s thing where both pop or classical engineers were called balance engineers. So I just put that in as a bit of nostalgia, actually realizing that most people who read it would have no idea what it means. But that's just being bloody minded, I guess.
I personally thought it was very cool. I thought I read it as a I definitely read it as a hark back to sort of 60s mentality of just balancing the volumes, essentially.
It is basically. I mean, back then you might have 8 faders, or less, and it was all about balance, and in many ways, nowadays there's so much emphasis on plugins and doing this and doing that and processing, but a lot of what makes things sound good or bad is in the balance, that you can hear everything that you're intended to hear, that the artists are, and get rid of the things that you don't want people to hear. and actually maybe going back to calling it balancing is subliminally for me part of the the ethics of the job. It's
rather than sort of just slamming plugins everywhere, it's just making sure the sounds are right in the first place and getting the you know.
Yeah, and making sure the sounds are good and that they're in relationship to each other. I mean, that's what balance is all about.
Yes, yeah.
Whereas, you can get carried away by just like making everything as loud as possible. We did actually have first things I learned in the 60s. And this came from some, I'm not going to name them, but it came from pretty prominent mentors at the time, which was basically, if you can't make it good, make it loud.
Right, wow.
And that was definitely, I mean, there was a lot of, I can't remember the word, not sarcasm. I can't remember. Anyway, what's the word that, we'll edit this in later if I anyway, it's driving me crazy now.
I'm terrible for it. I couldn't remember the word nostalgia the other day.
But yeah, anyway, we'll come back to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, so essentially, I'd like to go back to the beginning, if that's all right, and sort of work up through to sort of through the early part of your career and how you ended up. I'll have lavished everybody with all of the things that you've done in the introduction to this. So, so everybody will be aware of what you've done, and I'd like to sort of work up until now.
Okay.
So how you came from a family who was in the fashion industry, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you get involved with music? How did the music take your interest?
I don't know. I think it was in the family. I mean, my father was a great opera lover.
Oh,
and
wow.
He had an incredible selection of 78s back in the 50s, and so we grew up with that. And he would always be playing classical music, and I had piano lessons from about the age of 6, and I went to, so it was kind of in the family, but not in the business. And I, through my mother's side, I had red-green colorblind blindness, which meant that going into the fashion business wasn't really a great idea. Although I have to say that in the 60s, it didn't really matter too much because a lot of the colors were so over the top anyway. But anyway, I thought that, what happened is I lived with my parents and grew up in the 60s in St. John's Wood, literally 1 block from the studios. And the school that I went to was 2 blocks on the other side of the studios. So I had about a 10-minute walk to school every day, past the studios. And that was like starting in 1962, that school. So it was just something that you would walk past and say, oh, there's like 50, 60 girls standing outside studios. What's going on in there? And then when I was 13, my English master from the school said, we need some volunteers to come to EMI Studios to do some crowd noises for a drama recording.
Okay.
Which they did quite a lot of. Funnily enough, George Martin used to do a lot of those before he worked with the Beatles.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think they were doing Richard III, like a spoken word recording, and they wanted some crowd noises. So a bunch of us 13, 14-year-olds went to Studio 2, where I think the Beatles were all set up because they were doing Help.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And all their stuff, as you've probably seen in photographs, was set up at the far end of Studio 2. And then this like bunch of school kids came in, and we said, don't go near the instruments. You just stay up and do what you're told. So we did that and like tried not to touch anything, but we're allowed to have a look around. And you can only imagine, like, if you're actually brought up in the 60s and here you're in the room where the Beatles not only recorded, but their equipment is set up for that afternoon. Because the Beatles never started recording until lunchtime or later. So we were there at like 10 o'clock in the morning. And we did that, and we were there for about an hour, and I thought, oh, this looks really cool. So then I kind of forgot about it for a bit, and I took my O-levels, and I did kind of okay, but not great.
Okay.
And I was like borderline on whether I could stay on and do A-levels. And I thought, well, I don't know. Over the summer holiday, over August, I thought, what should I do? Should I stay? You had to go back in September and give them a decision. So I wrote to a whole load of studios, including EMI. And there are a lot of studios around in London. I probably wrote about 20, 25 letters. And EMI wrote back immediately and said, we'd like to bring you in for an interview. So I went in for the interview, and it lasted about 10 minutes, and they asked me some crazy things about what exam. So what O-levels did you get? And I told them, and they asked me specific questions about each subject. And really some very short, quick interview. And 3 days later, I got a letter in the post offering me a job. So I go back to my English master, who I said, I think, I've had this offer. What do you think? He said, well, your chance of A-levels isn't that great. I'd take it. And I went to my father and I said, what do you think? And he said, well, I can get you hooked up with Marks and Spencer's management course in 2 years' time when you're 18. So if you want to do this for 2 years, right, go for it. So I did that. And to cut the long story short, I'd been doing working at studios for 6 months. And I came out of the gate one evening at 5:30, and there was my English teacher from school, because everything was very local. You know, the school was that close. And he asked me how I was getting on and whether everything was going well. And I, just did the normal little stop and chat in the street. And then as he was saying goodbye to me, he said, well, say hello to Gus Cook for me. And Gus Cook was actually the assistant manager at the time.
Oh.
And I said, how do you know Gus Cook? And he said, well, he's my next door neighbor, and his wife and my wife are best of friends, and we've known each other for years. And with that, he just winked at me and walked away.
Amazing. So he'd clearly put a good word in for you and a bit of a,
It must, I mean, look, to this day, I still don't know. I really don't know. But the evidence is kind of...
Oh, there must have been something about you as well. I mean, so I find that story really interesting. Spoke with Malcolm Toft, and he had not a dissimilar story about a quick interview and a quick turnaround in getting into the job. It just seems to be the way that EMI operated at that time.
Well, they either like the look of your face or not, right? But the thing about my school teacher was he didn't want to tell me beforehand, because if I screwed up, I'd feel even worse that I'd let him down if I knew that he'd fixed it.
Yeah, yeah.
But the other thing, which sort of plays into another point, is that the system that they had at the time was that they weren't interviewing anybody older than 16.
Okay.
They weren't really interested in school qualifications. I mean, after a few months there, I was assisting Jeff Emmerich, right? And he started at 16. Although he was like maybe 5 years older than I was, so it all goes back.
Yeah.
And I think you've spoken to Ken Scott.
I have, yeah.
And he started at 16.
Yeah.
So the crazy thing that is very like off-putting and disappointing to young people now who, have got qualifications and, I understand Pro Tools and Cubase and blah, 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 everything, they know everything at their pre-time. At the time, it didn't matter. They just wanted people that they liked the look of, which is very strange, actually, because I had almost like a Buddy Holly look.
Okay, cool.
I had the Buddy Holly glasses, and I looked, I'd wear a suit and a tie.
He'd fit right in then.
Yeah, exactly. And so not only that, you look at these great recordings that we made, they were engineered by nerds, 16-year-old nerds in a suit and tie.
Oh, love it. I mean, you're sort of renowned for a a strong work ethic, and
Yeah.
I suppose that. I mean, did you have a strong work ethic at school that may have helped you in sort of your English teacher putting in a good word for you? Do you think?
Maybe I don't. I wasn't that great at school, to be honest, but maybe what do they say? A for effort.
I mean, it's something that I know that Abbey Road do now, even still, is write these sheets, ordering the gear for the next day's sessions and that kind of stuff. And I know I've read a lot about you're known for the sort of making meticulous notes on certain things. And is that a habit that was derived from your time at Abbey Road, or is that just a personal thing that you enjoy
definitely
doing?
Yeah, I mean, and I think one of the reasons that Jeff wanted me to work with him on Abbey Road was that I'd worked with him on a few things in 1968, which was my first year. And I was like writing everything. I mean, it was one of the things just for me to learn, because you have a lot to learn, because you're starting from a knowledge of nothing.
Yeah.
So the more notes you took, and just imagine like a 16, 17-year-old at the time, just very nerdy and very studious. And that's the look. As strange as it seems.
A 16-year-old nerdy Buddy Holly.
You got it.
Yeah. So were you followed the same sort of path of starting off in the? Did you work in the mastering department first, or did you?
That was they kind of stopped doing that by 1968.
Okay.
The first thing was working in the tape library, and you'd work in it, so you'd get an idea of how the tape system works and how the labeling worked and blah blah blah. That was quite a good idea. And then not only were you in the tape library, you're also like the runner. So they'd say, here, Studio 2 wants these tapes. So there'd be like a pile of 10 tapes to take down. And they said, so go down, and if they don't mind, just stand at the back and like just be a fly on the wall.
Okay.
And see what's going on. So I did that for 3 months. And then that was September to Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
And then after Christmas, I was called into the manager, and he said, well, there's now an opening down for an assistant. So when you come back after the new year, you're going to be in the studios. So that
Okay.
was, so I was only there for 3 months, and there were stories of other people who could be there anything from 6 months to 12 months, or even in one exceptional case, 2 years, because
Wow.
not because of their abilities, but because of lack of onward vacancies.
Yeah, yeah. So you moved. I mean, you were only an assistant for a couple of years, if I read rightly, as well. You seem to move through things very quickly.
Pretty much, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah. So yeah, I was in the library for 3 months, an assistant. I was an assistant for about 3 or 4 years, but I
Okay.
actually started getting first engineer jobs after 2 years.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things I remember, which was after the Beatles album, is George Harrison was doing his solo album, All Things Must Pass, and I wasn't on those sessions, but they called me in, and they said, and I had virtually no experience at that time of recording. I was a pretty good tape op. And they said, we need a rough mix of My Sweet Lord.
Okay.
And we need it now. So go into room 4, which was a mix room. And they gave me a piece of paper with some scribbled things of what to set up. So they said, take the tape of My Sweet Lord, set up these tape machines and plugged up in this fashion, and Phil Spector will join you in about 20 minutes.
Okay.
So I did that, and Phil Spector came in, and he basically, in less than 10 minutes, he dictated his interpretation of a mix of My Sweet Lord. Like he said, okay, put this track up, like bass and drums. And he said, okay, feed it through this tape machine with a 15-inch IPS delay on it. He said, now vary the speed, slow down the delay, and then increase the feedback on it. So basically, he told me word for word what to do.
Wow.
But I was doing it. He wasn't touching. There was a kind of thing in those days that the producers weren't allowed to touch any of the machines or the console. So he would just dictate this. And I'm not kidding. After 10 minutes, there was this. I mean, even back in those days, we were all in awe of his wall of sound thing that he
Yeah,
did.
of course. Yeah.
And he basically, I did one of these mixes, basically being dictated every single move by Phil Spector. I mean, he had such a strong formula that it could have been anybody doing it.
That's completely crazy. So so you must have been early 20s at that point.
Yeah, probably about either 19 or 20.
Yeah. Oh, that's absolutely madness. I mean, I'm reading Phil Spector's a book about Phil Spector at the minute, and so the Wall of Sound is kind of pretty high in my head at the moment. And that's like having it's like a masterclass in the Wall of Sound.
It was a masterclass, and I mean, the thing is, it wasn't actually finished. Like the big main guitar riff at the beginning, and it goes all the way through, wasn't on there yet. So it really was a rough mix, but it was certainly an experience to learn, because working with George Martin on the Beatles wasn't quite. It wasn't so hands. His advice would be a lot more musical.
Okay.
And concept and voicing of chords and stuff like that.
Okay.
But George wouldn't. He left the sounds more to the engineers, like Jeff.
That's really interesting. That even as you're talking about chord voicings and things, that's not something that I would It's not something I sort of stereotypically think about when I think about a sort of producer's role in say, like Beatles music or anything that George Martin worked on, really, and talk about arrangements. And in my immediate reaction to that is pulling things in and out of a mix, and actually George Martin, he had a huge background in classical music and understanding how all of that came about. So it makes complete sense that chord voicings and harmony would come into that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, on was it on Abbey Road because all those vocal harmonies were completely George. I mean, they called him down. I mean, the thing on Abbey Road is George. There was a lot of history before it started of the previous album, of Get Back and the White Album, and George not being involved in the same. When he came back to do Abbey Road, it was very much, well, I'll come in and I'll sit at the back of the room and let me know when you want something. And sure enough, whereas maybe someone like Phil Spector would have said, okay, do this, do this, do this, do this, right? And really, like, George was just, well, let me know what you want me to help you with. And they would say, George, we've got this song because, and can you come down and help us figure out the harmonies? Which, of course, he was so brilliant at.
Yeah, well, yes.
But I think it actually went much, it's difficult for me because only starting on their last album and all the stuff that had gone before.
Were you obviously Beatlemania had sort of been, or was, wasn't the sort of screaming girls necessarily at that point, but how aware of the build up to that? Sort of trying to build in my mind a picture of sort of a young engineer to be, where you were assistant engineer at that point, coming in and having to work with the biggest band in the world. How did you sort of balance that in your head in terms of what you knew of the Beatles' back catalogue and what you was sort of coming into?
It was really scary. The thing is, you've got to understand, I mean, nowadays with computer recordings, DAWs and virtual sessions, there's very little danger involved of damaging stuff. Mm-hmm. I mean, the worst you could do is wipe the hard drive, but you've probably got it backed up in the cloud somewhere. Yeah. Here, the tape was on open platters without a top plate. Okay. And so if you spooled back too fast, because there was like this variable knob that you could spool backwards or forwards, the tape could, and quite often would, fly off and mangle itself, right?
Yeah.
And when you would do, like on 4-track, or 8-track, you'd do a punch in. When you punched in, if you punched in early or late, you would erase something, and that thing was erased and it was gone. And it wasn't just anything; it was a performance by one of the Beatles. So that it was. I think there was a lot more in my mind, fear of screwing up.
Okay.
And just being overcautious for stuff. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I didn't. There was a thing at the time, because the job carried its hazards. One of my colleagues at the time, assistant engineer called John Smith, who I think worked on the White Album, he often got the punishment of screwing up, which was after the session, which would be maybe 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. He got locked in the echo chamber for a couple of hours as punishment. And what you have to understand about Studio 2's echo chamber is it was built in a converted garage. So it was actually outside of the building. So there was no heating, right? So in the winter, it would be freezing cold and damp to the point of mold.
Oh.
And the guys would, like if he did something really stupid or bad, they'd lock him in the echo chamber and then go back to the control room and listen to his screams on the mics. So, being, 17, 18 at the time, you think, oh no, I don't want to do anything, not just because I'd ruin a Beatles performance, but I might get locked in the echo chamber.
Oh, brilliant. I absolutely love that. I'm really interested to know, a couple of things. So as sort of, you were assistant engineering on that? Were you acting as tape op
Yes.
on those? Yeah. So what was, given that a lot of the album was written in the studio, must have been, was it frustrating at times having to do, I mean, presumably you were having to do a lot and then also just sit around a lot.
Yes. Yeah. But compared to other sessions, every other session was 3 hours long, and they were either 10 to 1, 2 to 5, or 7 till 10. And you would work and then you'd do a session. And the Beatles worked on their own time scale, which is we might arrive at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. And then it's straight through without a break, without leaving the room until 3 or 4 in the morning, which was completely foreign to all the other schedules.
Yeah.
So you had to really be asked and, agreed to do, will you work on the Beatles album? Because it isn't going to be 10 to 1 and 2 till 5.
Okay. So you knew what you were getting into before you started.
Yeah. And when I was asked by Jeff to work on the album, I went to Richard Lush, who was, another assistant who'd worked on Sergeant Pepper. And I said, why have they asked me to do this? And, Richard, who was very, very funny, he said, you'll find out. And I said, no, tell me, why? And he said, well, partially, he said, one, Jeff likes you, but you're the new kid. Which was putting it mildly, because not all the new kids got to work with them, but it was definitely something, that you had to sign up for and agree to do. And then, like you said, there was a lot of hanging around, a lot of waiting. They'd start an idea for something, and then another famous music star would show up, and it's suddenly, okay, John, play them this, and you'd be doing maybe 2 or 3 hours of playbacks just to entertain the visitors, which was more than that, because, if it was somebody, like Eric Clapton or Billy Preston, it'd say, oh, and, do you want to add anything to it? But, there was a lot of hanging around, like they say in the film business, hurry up and wait around.
Yeah, that's it. So it sounds like, obviously from what I've read about it, and I'm not, this isn't a question sort of made to sort of dressed as a gossipy thing. It sounds like the sessions were quite relaxed, and presumably they were fairly productive, and it was an enjoyable place to be at that point in their career.
Yeah, all the when I was started in the tape library for those few months, there were stories going on about the White Album and how it wasn't a great experience to be on. Yeah. So I missed all that. And I know that I'd read later on that when they'd asked George Martin to come back for this, it was on the condition that they behaved themselves. So, it got much more pleasant experience than some of the stories that have been going around.
Did I mean, when so like on a daily basis, were they quite sort of studious in terms of just wanting to make music, or was there, would they come in and have a chat with you about the way that the day was going, or were you very much just ready in position, waiting for them to arrive and sort of it was all
Yeah.
work?
Yes, pretty much the second.
Yeah.
the second scenario. I mean, it was basically you sit there next to the tape machine, basically wait to be told what to do.
Okay.
I mean, as an example of jumping ahead a bit of the whole medley, right?
Yeah.
Which there are many stories. I didn't realize. I honestly didn't realize, because nobody had told me, and maybe I didn't ask. Is all these collection of songs, which some were 30 seconds and some were a minute or a minute and a half. I didn't know what was going on. I mean, they were all on different reels and had been recorded at different times. And at no point, maybe this explains the atmosphere. At no point did I say, why are we recording so many snippets of songs, right? Because it wasn't like they were long 4-minute songs that had been cut down to one. They were actually recorded as a 30-second song or a 1-minute song. So it didn't make any sense.
Mm.
So that's how much I didn't know.
That's that is really interesting. And I mean, we're here, so we may as well, if you wouldn't mind sharing. There's an interesting story about Her Majesty. Is there not?
Right. So, I explained about all these snippets had been recorded separately at different times. And then towards the end of making the album, we had this afternoon and early evening where we did a stereo mix of all of these things. And then everyone else left except, I think, Paul, and I think George Martin. Sure, George Martin was there, but it was predominantly Paul, who had a running order and said, okay, we're going to do some crossfades where you overlap the end of one into the beginning of the other. And all these bits all joined together. And, like, okay, I get it. So we'd done the rough mixes and we'd done the crossfades, and then we edited them together, and it was my job to actually cut them together. And then about, I forget, maybe 2 o'clock in the morning, we played the whole thing through with Her Majesty's right in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul was like really happy with the whole thing. He said, I don't think Her Majesty's works. I think we should just cut it out, throw it away. Mm-hmm. So the piece of tape was probably only about 20 feet long. So I just cut it out. And because it was late and because it was a rough mix, we didn't undo the crossfades. We just chopped it out and put it together. And I played him the edit, and he said, that's fine, send it off to Malcolm Davis and he'll cut a lacquer tomorrow morning. And he went home. And there I was left with all the pieces. And this 20-foot piece of Her Majesty's was like lying on the floor. And what I should have done is really put it back in the reel that it came from. Mm-hmm. But again, explaining that just spooling backwards and forwards carried its own inherent dangers of screwing up. I thought, no, it's too risky and it's too late and we're all tired. I'm just going to tag it on at the end. Because I remember there was also another procedure that said, if you have a master tape, as opposed to a work tape, if you have a master tape and that tape gets damaged, it's okay to put it at the end and said X master not required after a length of red leader. So Jeff was still there, and I said, I'm just going to stick this at the end, because why don't we just call this tape a master? And we'll use that rule. So I stuck it at the end after some reading. I just put Her Majesty's unwanted track at end of after the Red Leader. So that went to Malcolm the next morning, who was actually working at Apple in Savile Row. And he cut the reference acetate. And Malcolm was like the same thing. I was very close to Malcolm. He was a good guy. And he thought, well, I'll just leave it on. So he cut, and then they came in. They came in the next. Sorry, something just distracted me.
It's okay.
So they came in the next lunchtime and played the acetate, and this whole thing. And you have to realize it was the first time that any of them had heard what Paul's vision was.
Okay, so the complete medley together, yeah.
Yeah, and because even with them, I think they were, even if they knew that it was all going to go together, they'd never actually seen how.
Yeah.
It was all in Paul's head of the running order of it, which is why he didn't want Her Majesty's in anymore. He didn't feel it worked. And then this magical, ethereal vocal harmony at the end of the medley. And, everybody the room was quiet and reflective for about 15 seconds until this thing comes crashing in. And they all burst out laughing. And, that I forget whether it's Paul or all of them, must have been unanimous. It stays in. And so what happened when the final version was done with not rough mixes, but final mixes, they actually used the same bit of tape from the Majesty's, which was the rough mix that had the cut off crossfade.
Oh, interesting.
And this actually leads to another interesting point, because in my experience of working on the album, they would record songs over and over again. Like they'd have an arrangement song, and George would help them with the harmonies and the voicings and the construction of the piece, and then record it, maybe record an hour and a half or 2 hours, and then come in and listen to it every take, even the ones that they thought were just rehearsals.
Wow.
They would listen to everything and be very picky and say, well, and make notes, and we all made notes, and then either choose a master or edit a master, or say, no, it doesn't work, but come back to it 2 weeks later and maybe record it at a different tempo or a different speed.
Okay, interesting.
Everything was very like in search of perfection. But then balanced against that was this thing like Her Majesty's, which was a pure accident where they would just accept it like that. Without any, there was no polishing or perfecting of this thing. They just, that was an accident. Let's keep it. Love it.
It's a sort of a real juxtaposition, isn't it, of both of those ideas? And it's
Yes.
I personally see in what I do, sort of playing drums for people, a search for perfection and the unwillingness to accept the happy accidents. And then you see sometimes too much of the opposite way, and it's a delicate balance that sounds like, well, we all know the Beatles got it perfectly, but I'd never quite heard it expressed like that, and I think it's really interesting to take note of. So there we go, part one of my conversation with John Kurlander. As I think I said in the back end of last episode, I think this might have been one of my favourite conversations to have, just because John's had such an eclectic career. You'll have to excuse, you might be able to hear my littlest girl who is 1.5, and she's just banged her head downstairs, so she's screaming. I just want to remind you that if you would like to buy a mug and support the podcast, they are beautiful enamel mugs displaying our wonderful logo designed by my friend David Henshaw. You can do that. So if you visit allyouneedisdrums.com, and there will be a link to the shop, and they will be on the shop by the time this episode goes out. So please do that and support the podcast and help these conversations keep going. So next episode will be the second part of my conversation, and I hope that you guys have a fabulous couple of weeks. So, and as usual, you can contact me if you'd like through Joe at All You Need Is Drums, or you can find me on Instagram, which is at All You Need Is Drums. There's also some peeping going on outside, which is the diggers, because I'm recording this at 10 o'clock in the morning and I live on a building site. So anyway, that just leaves me to say a huge thank you to my good friend Joe Kane for the intro and outro music for this podcast, and David Henshaw, the mug designer extraordinaire, and for supplying the artwork every fortnight for this podcast. So I hope you have a fantastic couple of weeks, and I will see you in part 2. Goodbye!